is what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. This episode is ad-free, and I rely on my audience to support my efforts. If you're getting value from this content, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Mind and Matter Substack. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to episodes and other content, full episode transcripts, and I'll prioritize answering your questions in emails and the comments sections. You can also support me by checking out the links in the episode description to my affiliate partners who make various health and wellness products that I use and enjoy myself. You'll receive a discount and help support the podcast that way. And if you want the benefits of a paid subscription, but it's not in your budget, simply sign up for my free weekly newsletter, send me an email, and I'll give you a complimentary paid subscription. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. So if you like what I'm doing, please share your favorite episodes with family and friends. The purpose of the podcast is to provide you with information obtained largely from primary sources, the people doing the research and producing new knowledge. This content is never meant to serve as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the episode. Just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what you study?
Well, I'm a Paleolithic specialist, and I study animal bones, mostly in Europe, more specifically in France and Montenegro. And, I started working about 20 years ago. I'm a specialist of Neanderthals and early modern humans. And I would say most of my research focuses on diet, subsistence, foraging, and I do a bit of more and more, I would say over the years, I'm doing more and more ethnography and ethnohistory. So the study of non-Western societies. And I try to use that as kind of framework to help me interpret the past.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular period in time that you focus on?
Yeah, so when I say Neanderthals and early modern humans, so I study mostly people who lived about 200 to 50,000 years ago. That's basically the range I work on, but I've worked on stuff that is like almost 600,000 years old.
Mm-hmm. And would this be the Paleolithic period?
Yeah, so that would encompass the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic as well. Sometimes I work on later stuff, but mostly it's the Paleolithic, and I would say the later part of the Paleolithic.
And can you just talk about like what is the Paleolithic era? When did it start? When did it end? And what defines it? Are there particular archaeological discoveries or events in history that dictate where to start?
Yeah. So the Paleolithic starts as soon as we have any cultural objects, and so objects made by humans with the goal of assisting them in their activities. So in Africa, it starts about 3.3 million years ago. And we usually take our emergence of agriculture as the end of the time period. So this occurred about 12,000 years ago in the Near East.
I see.
So basically 3.3 million years ago to 12,000 years ago. That's the Paleolithic.
I see. And over that period of time, just in very general terms, where were humans coming and going? So at the beginning of the Paleolithic, where was our lineage of humans? And by the end, where were we across the globe?
Yeah, so the Paleolithic, it's a world of hunter-gatherers. Okay, so there's no agriculture, and it starts in Africa, and we have hints that there's some expansion of hominins out of Africa, starting probably around 2.5 million years ago. So they start to colonize the the southern part of Europe, mostly Southeast Europe, and then they move into the tropics of Asia. And so we find them, probably around 2 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago in Southeast Asia. And then the two continents are populated later. So Australia would be probably occupied around 45 to 60,000 years ago. And then we have occupation of the Americas about 25 to 30,000 years ago.
The first species of hominids that were leaving Africa, what subspecies would that be? Was that Homo erectus? Was it some other species?
Well, that's a good question. People are debating this. So some people have argued they're possibly later, the very late Pleistocene, very late Australopithecines. Other people think it's only early Homo that we're moving out. So that's still debated. So I think on the safe side, we would say these are early Homo populations.
Mhm. When we think about the evolution of the genus Homo, that would include ourselves, that would include Neanderthals and other things, what what are some of the key phenotypic features of this genus that distinguish it from other mammals? In particular, I'm hoping you can start out by talking about like physical adaptations, musculoskeletal adaptations, aspects of the body that relate to how we move throughout the world. What are some of the key adaptations of Homo?
Well, what we see in the early Homo is we see first they're getting taller relative to Australopithecines. So Australopithecines are basically the height of modern chimpanzees. And so with the early Homo, we see people are standing up and now are close to, our height. Uh, we see in their body that, especially with Homo erectus, the postcranial that is down the neck, we see that they are having features that are similar to what we see today. So most of the changes that we see in early hominids occur before they move out. These hominins moved out of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically it's quite similar. We see throughout the Paleolithic, an enlargement of the brain. So that's probably a major change we see. And contrary to what has been thought, a century ago, and perhaps even 50 years ago, is that what we see is that the brain comes late in the human story, the enlargement of the brain, as we have tools way before we have large brains.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the like musculoskeletal changes that happened that enabled Homo generally and Homo sapiens in particular to be a hunter-gatherer species,
Yes.
to engage in the types of foraging and hunting behaviors that are typical of humans?
So what we see in humans that is very different from other mammals is that we have two key features that are quite distinct. First, we have the ability to sweat a lot. Okay, and this might seem not particularly adaptive, but there's a good reason for this. Is that humans need to in prolonged activities, you need to dissipate heat. Okay, so for instance, if you're running and you're running for extended periods of time, what will happen is that your body will build up heat, and if you don't have an efficient way of evacuating this heat, you will overheat. Basically, think about a car that has no radiator. You can do so much, but at some point the car will overheat, and you'll be forced to stop. So that's the same thing with our body. So we need to evacuate this heat. Animals like cheetahs, for an example, it's a very good example of an animal that can sprint very well, that can achieve almost 100 kilometers per hour. But this animal cannot sustain prolonged activity for more than a few minutes, and then they become, they overheat. So that's one feature, this ability to dissipate, building heat. The other feature is that our locomotor muscles, so the muscles that help us to move, they're dominated by what we call slow twitch fibers, whereas most other mammals have fast twitch muscles. So these ones, the fast twitch one, are related to power. So for instance, if you need to sprint, you will use these fast twitch fibers. And what's interesting about them is that these are they will use the stored glycogen in the muscle to fuel them. Whereas humans will use these slow twitch fibers, which are fed by our breathing. So in other words, when we run, for instance, you will note if you're running the first 30 seconds, your breath, your breathing rate will not change. That's because you're still working on the stored glycogen. But when you start to breathe heavily, that's because now you're starting to use the oxygen to help transport the glycogen to the muscles. Okay. And so that's why that's one feature that's very distinctive of humans is that we use these slow twitch fibers way more, and we have more of them.
So you've got slow and fast twitch muscle fibers. They have different physiological properties. I would assume that most mammals probably have some amount of both, but what you're saying, it sounds like, is that humans have proportionally more of the slow twitch fibers compared to the fast
Exactly. And more relative to our close cousins too. I mean, chimpanzees, like for instance, if you're involved in a fight with a chimpanzee, your butt will be kicked. Okay, they're really, really strong, much stronger than humans, and that's because they among other reasons that they have a lot of fast twitch muscles. Whereas humans, as I pointed out, they have these slow twitch muscles, and that allow them to run for longer with minimal use of fuel.
I see. So if you try to fight a chimpanzee head on, you're going to lose because they're way stronger, because their muscle composition and other things are different. But if you run away, you probably have a good chance of getting away.
Exactly. That's perfect. That's exactly it. Yeah.
And so if we sort of put all these things together, so we have this ability to sweat a lot, which enables us to dissipate heat. So we could move around in the environment for longer without overheating. We also have more of these slow twitch muscle fibers, which are less about power and strong bursts of energy right now, and they probably enable these slow twitch fibers more long-term locomotor activity. So does this point to an enhanced ability to engage in long distance running and something that might relate to certain forms of hunting?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So these two features indicate that there was selection for stamina in humans. Okay, not power, but stamina. And there are few contexts, few activities that would require that kind of stamina. And an obvious locus of selection is hunting and possibly scavenging. So we can imagine that humans found a niche in which, running, hours after hours after long, large prey was a locus of selection, and a niche that was not occupied by other mammals. And so that's what we think happened with, or at least these are factors that probably contributed to the evolution of these traits in humans.
Mm-hmm. And sort of related to that, I've seen some interesting data around some of our metabolic and physiological adaptations, in particular things that have to do with our digestive system. So if you just sort of take a broad view of human digestion and metabolism, and you ask things like, what does our gut look like? How long is our GI tract? What is our stomach pH? All of these types of things. And you compare it to other mammals, herbivores versus carnivores versus scavengers. What sort of metabolic profile or digestive system would you say humans have in comparison to other mammals? And how does that maybe start to tie into some of these physical adaptations that tell us about what early humans may have been adapting to in terms of diet?
Well, that's not in my area of expertise, but some notions that I'm aware of and I've worked on. For instance, if you think about pH, our pH is not that different from that of, let's say, of wolves, for instance, who are, noted for sometimes scavenging, and so or hyenas. So in that respect, we're not that different. Vultures have really high pH, so these are clearly animals adapted to
low pH or high pH?
High pH, so they can low pH, so they can process these very rotten meat in a way that we cannot. And so no, sorry, low pH.
Low pH, high acidity.
Yeah, exactly. So they can tolerate very acidic things, and so that helps them to process rotten meat. And so this could also be, in some way related to our ability to use scavenging as a form of meat procurement method.
Hmm.
So that would be one thing. Other people think that our gut became larger for processing complex carbohydrates, and that might be related, for instance, to an increasing use of plants and plants that contain toxins. The invention, or I would say the discovery of fire and the use of fire could be related to an attempt by humans as an attempt to reduce toxicity of plants. And so cooking helps in this way because you can get rid of some of these toxins by this way.
Mhm. When were humans first using fire?
Well, that's a very controversial problem. I would say there's a safe answer. The safe answer is that at least 400, maybe 500,000 years ago.
Mhm.
Now, there's another answer which suggests there might be some evidence for use, but I would say on an occasional basis, maybe ad hoc basis, and that could go as far as some say 2 million years ago.
Hmm.
So steady, consistent use of fire is recent, 500, maybe no more than 500,000 years old. But regular, occasional use could have occurred a little bit earlier. But again, that's debated. And one reason it's because many fires might have been very ephemeral, and they might not leave archaeological signatures that are quite robust.
I see. So we know it's at least a certain amount of years old, and it might be
Yeah.
older, but we just can't detect it, or humans weren't using it frequently yet.
Yeah, and it might have varied regionally. It's just that by 400,000 years ago, we're fairly certain that it's being mastered in many regions of the world and that it's a habitual behavior.
Mhm. And is that unique to Homo sapiens, or did other species of Homo have fire as well?
Well, we see it in Neanderthal. Some see it as a different species, some as a subspecies. So that depends on your view. Homo erectus, if we say 500,000 years ago, that would be Homo erectus. So, we can imagine that was used by several species. For instance, we know of the hobbit, the so-called hobbit in Southeast Asia. It's unclear yet if they use fire, but that would be another species.
Mhm. So humans have these adaptations that enabled stamina. We could run long distances. We could dissipate heat efficiently. We had the muscle composition that enabled all of that. It's presumably related to food procurement, whether that's active hunting or scavenging. For these early humans in Africa in the Paleolithic, do we have any good evidence as to the types of creatures that they were hunting or scavenging, the types of meat they were eating, or anything like this?
Yeah, so we know what range of species they're hunting. So if we go back 2 million years ago, it seems that they are already able to procure some large game, such as gemsbok or hartebeest, or and some smaller ones, probably dikers. These animals were probably in the range of what they could acquire. Elands are also thought to be sometimes acquired. But there's some debate about the larger range, the larger game. Something they were probably scavenged more frequently than eaten. But so it's unclear. But at least for the medium size animals, something like maybe a gemsbok, that seems to have been in the range of what humans could acquire. For those who are unfamiliar with these species, James Buck would be about the size of, let's say, a caribou in North America.
Like a big deer.
Yeah, so a big deer. Yeah.
And do we know, like, when these early humans were hunting, was meat like that? Was it an occasional treat that they would get whenever they could? Was it a very was it a staple of the diet? What proportion of the diet came from hunting? And do we know very much about like the full composition of these early human diets?
That's very difficult to answer. We think that if they show up in the archaeological record, it means it's more than occasional.
Hmm.
But whether this is a staple, that remains to be, determined. Um, we have quite a few evidence, that they're, like we have slice marks or tool marks on bones that suggest they're using different species. We know they're extracting marrow very early on. By 2.5 million years ago, they're already extracting marrow. In fact, that might have been one of the main incentive to hunt these animals, to get fat, because marrow is full of fat. So fat is often more important in modern foragers than the acquisition of meat, actually.
Hmm. So it sounds like it's hard to get a lot of direct evidence for this stuff, but we have
No.
things like bones with cut marks, and it's common enough that when you see it in the archaeological
Yeah,
record, it couldn't have been rare because otherwise we just wouldn't find
exactly.
artifacts like that. Um, are there also indirect sort of measures of this type of thing? So, for example, I know that when you look at cave art, a disproportionate amount of the cave art seems to be centered on animals that presumably would
Yeah.
have been hunted, and that would suggest that perhaps it was quite common.
Yes. So there's cave art, but before we address cave art, there is also some isotopic studies. So
Mm,
when you eat certain animals or certain types of resources, you will acquire some isotopes through the tissue, and this might be detected by looking at and by extracting collagen from the bones. You might be we're able to make some inferences. So we know when we look at early hominins, it looks more like they're eating plants. The acquisition, or at least the procurement of game, seems clear in Neanderthals. Uh, so it seems to be in fact, Neanderthals have been described as a hypercarnivore, which is probably, a stretch, but they're definitely, having meat on a regular basis. So probably I would say by I would say 500,000 years ago, humans eat meat on a regular basis. Now, with respect to cave art, the oldest cave art is about 50, 50, maybe 55, 60,000 years ago,
mm,
60,000 years old. And what we find, the earliest ones are not depictions of animals. They're often dots or hand stencils.
mm,
Uh, so the cave art with representation of animals slightly younger, maybe 45, 40,000 years ago. And, we see a range of animals. Often they are spectacular ones. We have bisons, cave lions, stuff like that. And whether this indicates that people are trying to acquire these animals, or they are somewhat scared by these animals or trying to acquire the power of these animals, is, of course, a matter of a debate. And uh, the true meaning of this cave art remains a little bit nebulous to us. But what's interesting is that when you look at the skills that are shown in these things, uh, early on they look like, Leonardo da Vinci. Some of them are really already beautiful and spectacular.
So it sounds like the earliest hominids were eating mostly plants, maybe occasional meat. So, in broad terms, probably not that different from something like, great apes like chimpanzees, mostly plants, but some animal-based foods. And then as our lineage emerged, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, we have these adaptations that allow, we had bigger brains happening. We had the ability to have more stamina evolving that unlocked the ability to hunt. And so meat became more important in our diet than it was for other apes, but we're still eating an omnivorous diet.
Yes. What's important to emphasize, and this point is sometimes overlooked, is that chimpanzees and bonobos, which are our closest ancestors, they both hunt. They don't
Mm,
hunt very frequently, but they will hunt, especially red colobus monkey, sometimes duikers, which are small antelopes. They can acquire turtles, so they can hunt, and they're successful to some extent. It's highly variable regionally. Some population will hunt more frequently than others, but it's there. It until maybe 20 years ago, it was thought to be extremely marginal, and now there's some evidence that in some population it's a, I would say, a treat, something not common, but it's definitely there.
I see.
So in other words, humans are not qualitatively different in that respect from the apes and bonobos. It's more the extent and the size of the animals that we capture that is different.
Hmm.
No chimps will capture something as big as a caribou. You
Hmm.
know,
And
their
that's probably
largest
simply
animals.
because they don't have physiological adaptations that enable them to catch an animal like that.
Yes, and also because they don't use tools for that,
Mm.
or they use very similar, it's not exactly true. They do use some tools, but often it's for acquiring, the tissue itself. So they might bang a tortoise on a tree to open it and stuff like that. Or there's some suggestion made, sometimes they may be using stones, but it's unclear, to what extent they use tools. But overall, when we look at them, it's mostly catching by the hand,
Mm.
which limits what you can do.
Right.
Humans use projectiles, they use snares, they use traps and other methods that allow us to overtake, prey that are much larger than ourselves.
Hmm. And what kind of artifacts do we have for the tools humans were using for hunting when it became more common? Were they using spears and projectiles like that? Were they also using traps and other things? Was there a preferred method for killing
That's
game?
that's an excellent question, one that I've been working on for a while. The oldest tools that we have, the oldest spears are about 400, 300, 400,000 years old. We don't have any bow and arrow that are older. Some say that they're already present by 60,000 years ago, indirectly based on the size of the spear points or the arrowheads. Uh, for snares and traps, these are very ephemeral products, and so we don't know at all when they were used. I assume they're quite old. We know indirectly there's some figurines made of clay in Gravettian context, so about 30,000 years ago. And these figurines, they show nets on the hair. And so these nets, if they were used for, as a piece of, as clothing or at least used for clothing, it's possible that they could have been these skills could have been transferred to hunting. So we could assume that there are nets at least 30,000 years ago, but for anything older, the question is open.
Hmm. So, roughly 500,000 years ago, I think, is when our lineage diverged from Neanderthals. And so we sort of go down two separate routes to some
Yeah.
extent. Um, Neanderthals get to present day Europe before our lineage, I believe. And eventually our lineage goes out of Africa, goes into Eurasia, and eventually, moves west and colonizes what is present day Europe. And they encounter Neanderthals along the way. As Homo sapiens was leaving Africa and starting to populate Eurasia and into Europe, do we know anything about their diet and how it might have been changing over the course of that period?
Yeah. So when we look first, what's important is that there was the divergence between Neanderthals and modern humans, but there are also some significant gene exchange.
Mm.
That's why we see they call it introgression. So we have some evidence that there's, it's not two populations completely diverging. There's some divergence, but also some exchange of genes in the process. Now, with respect to their diet, that's a topic that I've worked on. Um, we don't see any major differences in terms of what modern humans and Neanderthals eat. In fact, there's almost a complete overlap in terms of what they do.
Hmm.
Okay, they focus on the same kind of tissue, same kind of animals. Their transport behavior is similar, so they transport the same element, usually for fat. So there's no, on the basis of subsistence, there's no striking difference between the two population, either Neanderthals or modern humans.
Hmm. And how, like, what were they getting most of their fat from animal products?
That's a good question. In Southern Europe, it's possible that they got some through nuts. Okay,
Hmm.
you have some fat in nuts, but it's presumed that most of the fat came from marrow and the subcutaneous fat, that is the back fat that we see on animals.
Hmm. And so there was all of these introgressions. at least sporadically, between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. We exchange DNA. You can still see evidence of Neanderthal genes in you and me today. How often do we think that was happening? Was it pretty rare? Was it like, can you give us like a sense for just how rare or how
Yeah.
common it might have been?
Well, it was probably quite rare because if not, the two population, the genome would be more similar. In fact, it would be identical if it was very common. So there's enough for divergence to occur, but there was enough gene or gene exchange, which could have been maybe once a generation in between two population. And this was enough to prevent full divergence in that respect. And it's unclear still what happened to the last Neanderthals. Some people think it's related to, in fact, a different mode of survival, a different life way that was promoted by the modern humans when they invaded, and that these, cultural adaptation allowed them to overtake Neanderthals. In my opinion, I think it's related to the habitat that was occupied by Neanderthals. I think the habitat became in some way, there was a climatic deterioration about 45,000 years ago that was probably severe enough that the population became very small. And this could have led easily to small population simply collapsing because there's not enough gene flow between different groups. So in my opinion, ecological aspects or environmental aspects have been neglected in that respect.
Mhm. So, can you give us a sense for the time period in which there was the most overlap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations? Was it tens of thousands of years? How far back did that stretch?
Yeah, if you're in Southeast Europe and the Near East, there's evidence of Neanderthals in modern humans for at least 50,000 years, if not more. Okay, some say even 100,000 years. So there was significant overlap in terms of the use of these two areas. Now, with respect to whether they made contacts and everything, that's difficult to say. But in these regions, the stone tools made by Neanderthals and modern humans are not different, we cannot distinguish them. So this suggests there's some form of cultural transmission between the two groups, or at least diffusion of ideas that, cross-cut these boundaries or these genetic boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you've told us so far that Neanderthals had a very similar diet to Homo sapiens. It sounds like we were using the same hunting tools, and therefore we would have had comparable hunting abilities. We know that they had big brains. What about culture? To what extent did Neanderthals have culture? Do we see them using art and ornamentation and the types of markers that Homo sapiens groups use to define one group versus another group?
20 years ago or 30 years ago, the answer was no. Neanderthals didn't have much, didn't show any evidence that they were using symbols in any forms. But in the last, 15, 20 years, there's, I would say, growing evidence that they were habitually using symbols. For instance, with some colleagues, we published a number of claws from raptors. These claws shows cut marks on them, and these claws would not have been edible. So we think that they were probably used as some form of ornamentation. And that's interesting because claws, for instance, wolves have claws, bears have claws, yet they use only raptors and not a very specific range of raptors, the big ones like vultures and eagles. And so it's hard to escape the conclusion that this had no symbolic reason behind it. So
I see.
Yeah.
So enough of those artifacts exist where you see the raptor claws, the claws from birds of prey, showing up over and over again, but you don't see it from other creatures.
Exactly. So it's a combination of evidence here. The fact that it's always large raptors. There are not many. It may be one per site. Now we have probably 30 sites in Europe showing this use of raptor claws. And what's interesting is that, as I said, large raptors and it excludes other form of claws from other animals, like, as I say, carnivores or herbivores. The claws are not used for same purposes. So for this reason, it's probably linked, at least in my opinion, to some form of symbolic cues.
What about other cultural artifacts from Neanderthal sites? Do you see clothing? Do you see beads? Anything
So
like that?
returning to the question of symbolic use, so what's very well known and has been known for a while is that they're using pigments, mineral pigments like ochre, manganese, and so it's open. This is a little bit more, I would say, difficult to interpret because some people think this could be related to non-symbolic use. That is, for instance, some people think it might be for cleaning skin, for instance, and other purposes. But I think there's some evidence, for instance, in Iberia, where pigments are associated with some bone tools made by Neanderthals, and so it could have been used for decoration, or body ornamentation. There's also some cave art now that is thought to date from the period that was occupied by Neanderthal. So we would have Neanderthal cave art. Again, these are hand stencils or dots on cave walls, and these date about 50,000 years ago in a period that would have only been occupied by Neanderthals. Although this has also been challenged recently. There are some people think there's some modern human incursion in the upper Paleolithic, in the middle Paleolithic in France and in Iberia, but that's quite controversial.
And in terms of these cultural artifacts that are tied or potentially tied to Neanderthals, do we know, is there any strong evidence that these were Neanderthal inventions? They came up with these things independently, or is it possible that they acquired them from coming into contact with Homo sapiens, or vice versa, that we acquired maybe some things from them?
Yeah. For the raptor claws, as far as I know, this is a feature we only see in Neanderthals. Pigments are found, from basically from France to South Africa. So this seems to be, a widely spread trait. For cave art, we see very early cave art in Southeast Asia, probably around 45 to 50,000 years ago. So this would be linked probably to modern humans, but again, this is unclear. So right now, a few lines of evidence that is only limited to Neanderthals or modern humans. But for instance, modern humans early on, by 50, 60,000 years ago, they're using, and even before that, they're using shells, shells that are found on the beach. These sometimes have natural perforations, and they're used possibly as necklaces. These are not found in Neanderthals as far as I know. So there's some differences like that. But that's to be expected because we have some regional variation. I think the point here is that whether it's shell or claws is not important. What is important is the fact that both are some form of symbolic, and they're present in both populations.
And approximately when did Neanderthals disappear? When were they gone for sure?
Well, that would have happened about 30 to 40,000 years ago. That's about the dates we have, even, so 40, 35,000 years ago, that's where the last Neanderthals, those that are anatomically identified as Neanderthals, these are the last ones we find.
Are there any Neanderthal burial sites where there are indications that they buried their dead on purpose?
Of course, that's an important line that I forgot to mention. So in fact, Neanderthals are some of the earliest Neanderthals that we found in 1908 and are from burials. For instance, La Ferracie or La Chapelle-aux-Saints, these are burials. There has been some debate about whether they are true burials, but for people like me who work on fauna, this does not seem very convincing because when you look at the fauna is shattered. We never find refits between, we only find sometimes a complete wrist or a complete foreleg, but that's very rare. And so when we see these complete fully articulated Neanderthal individuals, for us, that it's clear it's related to intentional burial.
Hmm.
Some people have argued that this has no symbolic purpose. That's possible, but I think that's in some ways some kind of double standards, because if it was a modern human being buried in that position, nobody would question that it has symbolic meaning attached to it.
Mhm. I mean, I think we've already hinted at this to some extent, but how has our picture of Neanderthals and how sophisticated they were changed over the past few decades? And how does that relate to, I don't know, any potential biases we might have as humans wanting to think that our lineage
Yeah,
is
well,
special?
yeah, Neanderthals have always been, well, we still say, my brother looked like a Neanderthal, or so we still have this idea that Neanderthal is somewhat retarded, or backward and so on. So I would say the last 50 years has been to push the boundaries about their cognitive abilities. Uh, like, in the 80s, there was a much debate about whether they could speak. Uh, Now we say they're able to, express, some form of symbolism. So we have moved a lot. We have moved a lot. A lot of the arguments that have been put forward to show that they could not survive have not fared well over the years. And so that's why people like me would emphasize rather environmental factors to explain their extinction rather than some cultural ones.
Hmm. And it sounds, based on what you told me before, like it wasn't like modern humans and Neanderthals met and then Neanderthals very quickly disappeared. It sounds like it was a pretty gradual process, and you have smaller and smaller pockets of Neanderthals persisting near Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years, and they just sort of gradually fade away. Is that more or less
Well,
accurate?
yeah, I would say that's variable regionally. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, in the Near East, clearly the both populations seem to have coexisted for long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
But in other regions, for instance, if you go to Western Europe, um, at least at the geological scale, this was fairly quick. So, or Russia, for instance. So it depends where you are, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why it makes it a little bit difficult to make general to look for a general factor to explain the disappearance of Neanderthals, because they are variable.
Mm-hmm.
Those who live in Iberia had probably a life way that was quite different from those who live in the Near East, for
Mm-hmm.
instance.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, because even among modern human populations that I've discussed with others on the podcast, right, it depends on the region. Sometimes two groups come together, they mix a lot. Sometimes one group wipes the other one out very, very
Yeah.
quickly. Sometimes they sort of live in close proximity, but effectively in separate niches, and they don't really interact that much. And it probably just really depends on where you look on the globe.
Yeah, I think the real challenge is that if we had only the archaeology, we would not see two species or two semi-species. When we look at the physical or skeletal evidence, we seem to see, different populations. And that's why it's hard to reconcile the two, based on the cultural aspect, they don't look that dissimilar. But the skeletal, specialists tell us that you can easily, not easily, but you can segregate the two population based on their features. And so the challenge has been trying to reconcile these two lines of evidence that conflict, on two important aspects.
Mhm. By the time you get to the late Paleolithic, if you just look at the bones of Homo sapiens and you compare them to modern humans today, are we more or less phenotypically identical to humans from the late Paleolithic, or are there distinctions between us now?
Um, I'm not a specialist on this question, but I would say, based on my knowledge, the distinctions are not different. That being said, we know from a genetic perspective that there are some important distinctions. For
Mhm.
instance, tolerance to lactose, this is a recent trait. It was evolved at least twice in Europe and Africa, if I remember correctly. And this occurred in less than 6 or 7 thousand years ago. So we know genetically speaking that some of these features are very recent. They don't show up in our skeleton, but they're there.
And so, what were there any major, so when humans left Africa, Homo sapiens, some of them went east, some of them went west, they went to all different parts of the globe. Were there any, how much divergence was there in terms of physical adaptations related to things like diet and hunting strategies? Did it vary heavily region to region, or are there a lot of similarities?
Well, I would say it has to, because if you're in Southeast Asia, the range of species you can hunt is very different. The plants are different too. What we know, for instance, in Southeast Asia, there's evidence for fishing that is quite early, by 45,000 years ago. We have also evidence they're using some trees, squirrels, which probably required some form of projectiles, maybe blowpipes, stuff like that. So some of this occurs very early in that region. Whereas if you look in France, for instance, at the same time, they're basically just hunting large game. So there's quite a bit of variation, when you compare different regions, and that's to be expected.
Mm-hmm. And so in the work that you've done related to ethnography and looking at hunter-gatherer tribes from more recent times, is there anything that studying recent hunter-gatherers tells us about the hunting strategies and things of ancient humans in terms of, when we think about the adaptations you spoke about earlier, our high stamina, our ability to sweat, like were we running down game, like running miles and miles and doing persistence hunting? What do we really think that hunting actually looked like that was unlocked by some of those adaptations?
Well, that's a good point. First, what we learn is that many archaeologists and many ethnographers tend to think that recent hunter-gatherers are more or less, or I would say, tend to perceive them as being relatively static. That is, not having changed much in the last century or 2 centuries. Whereas, and of course, that's here I'm exaggerating a bit, but when we turn to ethnohistory, so that is to the records left by people before the emergence of ethnography as a field, which occurred in the 1850s to year 1900, what we see are sometimes quite different pictures because people tend to forget the impact of colonization. It had a huge impact on native population. First, it led to decline in prey densities. That is, if you read some Jesuits or missionaries or travelers, they will all tell you that in the 19th century in Africa, there's a big decline in the number of large game that is being encountered. If you're in in North America, you will see similar picture where people say, since the Europeans came, we see fewer and fewer animals. Other introductions were really important. The horse in North America completely changed the way of acquiring bison. Mm-hmm. It also changed the way pronghorn antelope were acquired. In other regions, the impact was probably less important. For instance, in the north, horses are not as useful in the Arctic. So in this case, there was the impact could have been smaller, but then there are other aspects that were very detrimental, or at least had a significant impact. For instance, the introduction of firearms, especially the repeating rifle. The early firearms, contrary to what people think, early firearms, they were really bad. They would explode. The accuracy was low. They were noisy. And so natives were not really fond of early guns. In fact, when we read about, let's say 18th century accounts, the natives still use bow and prefer the bow and arrow because, it's more accurate and less noisy. Because with a bow and arrow, you can shoot 5 deer one after the other. But, with a rifle, you can only kill one because after that, the animal flee. Okay, so the noise created by the impact will scare the herd away. So these things in combination means that the native habitat, the ecology has changed significantly since the arrival of Europeans in North America and Africa.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is, we can't just, hunter-gatherer populations have changed for many reasons in the past few centuries for all, all the reasons that you mentioned. And therefore, we can't just look at recent hunter-gatherers and assume that they're a good proxy for ancient hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, and here, as I said, I've exaggerated that, archaeologists, ethnographers, they're not naive. They know things have changed, but I think the amount of change is underestimated. Okay, with the expansion of Westerners into Africa, Asia, and North America and South America, and uh, and also because these are the best models we have. We have so much data that at some point we forget that there are a lot of blind spots in our study, and therefore, like some were extremely influential, like the study of the San or the study of the Hadza or the Ache in South America. So these population became proxies, and in some ways, by because they were the only good models we had, they became the proxies for the Paleolithic. But when you go back in time using that no historical record, sometimes you see things that are now lost.
Mm-hmm.
And entrance pursuit of large game is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Until the 80s, this was not mentioned at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then David Carrier came up with this model of, he noted that there were some important differences in physiology between mammals and humans. And he suggested that this might be related to endurance hunting. And when we started to work on this, my colleague Bruce Winterhalter and I, this method was described as being marginal, anecdotal. It was described as costly. And in fact, when we started to dig into that historical literature, we started to find examples of endurance pursuit all over the world, not just in arid open environment that was assumed, but we found it in the tundra, we found it in the boreal forest, in the mountains of Hawaii, we found it in the tropical settings of Southeast Asia, in South America. So it became a common method. And when I say common, I don't mean that was practiced daily, but it was something that was habitually practiced in certain contexts. For instance, when there's a lot of snow or when the weather is very hot. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example of a technique that became obsolete when the rifles was introduced.
I see. Yeah, it makes sense to me that endurance hunting in particular would have been relatively common in our species because of the adaptations you spoke about before, our ability to sweat and the changes to our muscle fibers, because in the absence of those adaptations, hunting is still possible, right? Humans could have quietly crept through the woods and used camouflage to engage in hunting, but the endurance hunting aspect seems to be what those adaptations really unlocked.
Yes, and it's probably related to the context of hunting. But what's important also to notice about endurance pursuits is that they have a higher success rate than other methods, than many other methods, because you exhaust the animal. The animals does not have many options when it's getting very tired and overheated. Whereas an animal you're creeping on, well, the animal, often you cannot, keep in mind that these games have evolved and co-evolved with humans for a long time.
Yeah.
So their sense of smell is highly developed. Their sense of hearing too is well developed. So it makes it very hard to creep and come close to an animal. Like, for instance, a good example is moose. When you read about moose, people will say it's extremely difficult to get close or even to view, to see a moose. Most often, the animal will have vanished way before you see it. And so just to rebound on this, many people who describe endurance hunting will say that you run after an animal you don't see. You try to predict where the animal is going, and sometimes at some point you will succeed in catching up with the animal. The animal will be scared away, bounce, and leave again, and then you catch up again, and so on. And it's this repeating cycle of sprint and rest that leads to the procurement, or at least to success. Okay. So, and it's again, it's the buildup of heat that allow us to overtake these games. And other methods, either snaring, spearing, ambush, all these methods are associated with a lot of failures.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, I'm not sure if this is your area of expertise, but as you leave the Paleolithic and you get to the period of time when agriculture is developing, when people first started developing agriculture and becoming sedentary, did this lead to any phenotypic changes based on how their diet was changing? Because I've heard before things like, at the dawn of agriculture, skeletons start to become less robust. There are changes in bone density and teeth that have to do with eating different foods. Can you speak a little bit about what we might know there?
Yeah, so what we see, at least in terms of the skeleton, yeah, there's some evidence more cavities associated with a greater intake of plants. The skeleton is less robust, probably because they're running less, they're ranging less also. In terms of the brain, we don't, as far as I know, there's no difference. But there's probably also some genetic evidence that there's selection for greater tolerance to certain toxin. As I said before, lactose intolerance, that's a feature we see in many humans. This, with agriculture, often you have domestication of animals. With the domestication of animals, you have milking. And when you have milking, well, some people don't tolerate milk well. And so there was probably selection for people who can tolerate lactose better. And so all these things are indicating there are still significant changes occurring at the genetic level. At the skeletal level, the changes are more modest at the geological scale, of course.
Mm-hmm. What like when you look at modern humans, our lineage, in comparison to the many forms of now extinct species of Homo, what are like some of the salient differences that you think explain why our species persisted and these other ones declined all over the world? Does it have a lot to do with our symbolic cognition and our big brains and our ability to have and generate culture? Does it have a lot to do with our ability to adapt to physical environments and our locomotor capabilities and things like that? Or is it not so clear cut?
Well, one aspect that is very clear to me is the importance of socialization. When you look at other species, you don't see, for instance, sharing
Mm,
much other than between offspring and mothers. But in humans, you see humans giving food to non-kin, which is very unusual in mammals.
mhm,
And I think so that's probably one of the key features of our lineage is this uh, selection for increased socialization, increased cooperation. This is something again that is not seen is rare in other mammals. You will see it, uh, for animals that are gregarious to some extent, but not to the extent we see it in humans.
mhm. And do you think that relates at all to how our diet and our procurement of food evolved over time? So, for example, I could imagine, I mean, if you want to go hunt big game, you can do that in a solitary way, I suppose. But I imagine that a lot of those hunts probably require coordination between individuals. If you want to scavenge a big kill from apex predators, I would think that probably necessitates a group that really coordinates between each other and uses language and is able to move and use tools very quickly. Do we know anything about a relationship between the ability to cooperate in order to get food, either from hunting or scavenging, as being maybe part of the basis for our cooperative abilities more generally?
Yes, I think we can definitely say that procurement of food, the aspect of cooperating is very important, but not just with animals. For instance, with plants, it's very important to transmit information about plant phenology. For instance,
Mm,
if you are moving around the landscape, you need to know where plants are first, but also in what state. Do they have flowers? Are they, you know, where are the patches? How can you detect where, for instance, if you're looking for tubers, you want to know how deep they are, which one are likely to be edible, and so on. So this is a very important aspect. And now with respect to animals, well, if someone sees tracks of animals, because when you read the ethnographic record, the ethnohistorical literature, often people will say what's very critical is that I was informed there were tracks over there. And so a man will tell that his wife told him to look for steenbok in that region, or for gemsbok, or for caribou. So that's when you have individual hunting. But a form of hunting that has been very important before, let's say, 1900 was communal hunting. And we just published a paper. Actually, it's still not under review, but it's still being it's in press right now. And in this paper, we stress the importance of communal hunting as another form of hunting that was impacted by Westerners impact, sort about Westerners coming into Eurasia and so on. About Africa and South America and so on. And so in this paper, we stress that this is a locus for selection, probably because, with communal hunting, you increase also the odds of success, because by using a lot of beaters and by driving them toward a special locus, you can have spears who wait there. And, these hunts tend to have high returns, especially if you're hunting gregarious species like bison or caribou. Some of them, will result in large quantities of meat being acquired. But then this creates a collective action problem. How do you distribute this meat? Who gets a part?
Mm-hmm.
Is it only the person who have hunted? Is it the person who were beating? Those who did not collaborate or could not collaborate, do they get a share? So these creates, very important problems where socialization becomes a key. And so I think that might have been a key, I think, in terms of the evolution of socialization in humans. I mean, these kind of settings.
Mm-hmm. And, given how much diets varied regionally and across time, even before the dawn of agriculture, right?
Yeah.
People living in different parts of the world would have been eating, vastly different things just based on the local flora and fauna that was in their habitat. Given that diversity, does it make a lot of sense to you when people today talk about things like the Paleolithic diet?
For archaeologists, this is a nonsense. This is pure nonsense. There is no Paleolithic diet. There are paleo diets, plural. And because this is not possible, when you look at the diversity, I mean, it would be, in terms of selection, it would be crazy to have a paleo diet, because in some regions, plants are not available during, 2/3 of the year. In other regions, large game is not abundant. In other regions, what you have are marsupials rather than placental mammals. So you have to adapt to the environment, and that calls for flexibility. That's what we see in humans: variability, flexibility. So the paleo diet is nonsense to archaeologists.
And when so one of the key physical adaptations we talked about was aspects of the body that enable physical stamina, and that unlock the ability to do things like endurance hunting, as we were talking about. This also presumably created a selection pressure for mental stamina. We had to, focus on a problem for extended periods of time. So do you think that those two things evolved hand in hand, the ability for physical stamina on the one hand and our attentional capacities, our ability to sustain attention on the other?
That's an excellent question. I think I found an excerpt about mental stamina maybe just a month ago. It was really interesting because the guy was saying we have in our group, I think he was a Anishinaabe, or so someone from the boreal forest in Canada, around the Hudson Bay, and he was saying basically we have, in a paraphrase, basically said we have something about mental toughness that is being transmitted between, in our group. And we tell each other, and we, tell the kids how it's important to, keep on running and running and running and not give up because the animal will give up before you and so on. So there's part of it that's probably cultural, whether it's also genetic, that's a topic that would be a little bit more difficult to evaluate. But clearly there's something about cultural transmission that's important. And one thing we have to keep in mind too is that running, it has other important evolutionary implications. Keep in mind that in a Paleolithic past, what we have are groups that are competing for resources, so warfare. And in the context of warfare, running is key. Mm-hmm. So we see, even if our sample of running pursuits just show basically the presence of males, females are poorly represented in our sample, maybe 4 or 5%. We have a lot of evidence that women are running and training for running. And we have, examples where dads are telling their daughters, you have to know how to run because it might save your life, And so this aspect is also critical to keep in mind when we address this problem.
Mm-hmm. And as is the archaeological record rich enough that we can see, as humans were spreading across the globe, we're hunting animals of different types. How sensitive were humans as they were migrating to the maintenance of animal populations they were interested in hunting? Are there any instances pre-colonialization, before modern technology, before guns and those things, would people move into a region and just sort of hunt everything until it was gone? Did that happen sometimes? Were they able to figure out how to hunt enough to feed themselves, but not so much that they deplete local populations? Or did ancient humans drive a lot of animals to extinction through hunting?
That's an interesting debate. What we see, you have to think a little bit about how the natives see these things. First, natives are incredibly knowledgeable about animals. It's just astonishing the amount of information they know. One aspect that is harder for them to evaluate is the metapopulation level. For instance, if you hunt caribou and you live in a region, let's say close to the Hudson Bay, it's really hard for you to know how the population is doing at the scale of a continent. And so your decision will be, of course, based on your local knowledge. And so when you ask about, when you ask natives, or at least when you read about natives, what they say, often they say, if you kill an animal, the animal is not really dead. Its soul, if you behave in a respectful way, and if you do the proper ritual, the animal will actually go, or the soul of the animal will go and will create a new animal. And in fact, the animal will come back. And they say that about fish, for instance. You say, if you treat fish with respect, the fish will come back. I even found an example where the guy says, I made a mark on the bone just to make sure. And then later on, I found another animal of that species, and I found the same mark. So the animal came back. And so when you have this kind of thinking, then you don't have the idea that the species can become extinct. Because if you are spiritually and ritually taking care of the animal will come back. And so some studies have been done, some ethnographic studies have been conducted, and the natives are not trying to minimize their intake of females or, of juveniles. They just kill what they need. So, and I would say that makes sense, because if they have been doing it for, millennia, why would you change your method? Why would you start to focus on certain game? And for those who do ecology, in fact, if you kill a lot of animals, you reduce pressure on those who survive, and those who survive will often do better. And so they come back. So extinction is a very difficult concept until you have some metapopulation data. In fact, until the early 20th century, we didn't have a really good idea of extinction.
Mhm.
It was a topic that was really hard to address because we had poor data. And so, to make a story short, extinction is not something that people worried about when they hunt because their method had a small impact on the game population, and also because they believe that if you are treating animals with respect, they come back.
Mhm. Where do you think like a lot of those rituals and spiritual beliefs, do you think at all about like the purpose, the sort of ecological purpose of those things for human hunter gatherers? Are those, are the spiritual practices and beliefs that the different tribes have, are they epiphenomenon or do they serve some kind of behavioral regulation purpose that's important for
Well,
survival?
that's a good question too. We talk all, there's a lot of talk about sympathetic magic. You can imagine if you are, living in a boreal environment where, it's cold during 6 months, there's no plant. So, game procurement is critical. One way to reduce stress is to use rituals, and, to reduce ambiguity about, procurement. So these rituals often have this purpose of trying to help, and to secure success in the future. So there's some, I would say, maybe evolutionary aspect in that respect. So it's cultural, but it has some evolutionary implications too.
Hmm.
So I would not dwell too much on that, but it's interesting to keep in mind that these things are there because there's some stress in the first place.
Mhm. What so over the course of your career, in your own understanding of Paleolithic humans and the evolution of our lineage, what's something that has what's an example of something where your viewpoint has changed or the field has really come to a different conclusion in terms of where it's at today compared to where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago? Are there any major sort of 180s or something like that that we've done in terms of how we think about the evolution of early modern humans?
I would say that happens a lot,
Mm.
more than you would expect. For instance, the idea that the Middle Paleolithic was only occupied by Neanderthals was a given for everybody. Now it's being, thought as something to rethink about. That's a good example. Endurance hunting is an example. I didn't know about this method, or well, I should not say I didn't know, but I thought really it was marginal. And so that's an example where I completely changed my mind about its importance. Um, I remember the Hobbit, the discovery of the Hobbit in
Mhm.
Southeast Asia, some kind of species that looked like an Australopithecine, but dating to 100 to maybe 50,000 years ago. That came to a shock to everybody. Nobody thought that there was nothing, that there was a species that would look like an Australopithecine, but being so young in age. So that's another example. Um, Another one, and this is more of a conceptual one, 40, 30, let's say 30 years ago, the idea of speaking about kinship, how people relate to each other, was unthinkable when you think about the Paleolithic. There was nothing we could use to talk about kinship. But now with DNA, there's a study that has been published a few years ago where they say Neanderthals were patrilineal, which means basically males stick together and women migrate to other groups.
Hmm.
This is something that we never thought we could do. I never thought this would be possible to talk about this in my lifetime. And this is a major, for me, a major kind of change. So some are technological discoveries, some are important, I would say, conceptual findings. Another example is the importance of fat. Before I started doing Paleolithic research, I never thought that fat was that important. Like any Westerner,
You mean like
Western,
dietary fat?
yeah, we think about meat. When we think about animals, we talk about meat. Always talk about meat. Whereas when you talk to a native, it's about fat. They
Mm.
wonder about how fat the animal is. They
Mm.
don't really care about the muscle, you know. Another example, a few years ago, I published with my colleague John Speth about rotten meat. Rotten meat is something that Westerners think is, not eatable. Well, we found tons of evidence that it's being eaten and sometimes preferred by natives in a rotten state because it makes digestion easier and some prefer the taste. And so that's another example where rotten meat was considered a no-no. And then, by doing some ethnohistorical research, you discover that no, this is a control construct. Actually, rotten meat is palatable. And if you're used to eating rotten meat, well, over the years, you will, be able to metabolize it in a reliable way, and you'll be fine.
That
And
would
so,
actually, that reminds me of what we spoke about earlier, where we talked about the fact that humans, like certain other animals, wolves, hyenas, vultures, that
yeah,
scavenge a lot of meat, eat a lot of rancid or partially rancid meat. They have very low, very acidic stomach pH. Is it possible that this is something that goes way back? Humans were scavenging meat to some extent for a long time, and
likely,
it's actually a modern aberration that we think of meat
yeah,
that's been
that's
sitting out as a
probably the
bad thing.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's striking, and when I say rotten meat, I don't mean like high meat. I mean like meat full of maggots, like really, really transformed. Okay. Really, rotten, not
Yeah.
just high. And some groups, we have examples, an excellent example during the Franklin expedition, when they were trying to find the Northwest Passage. There's an Inuit guy who come to the boat of the Franklin expedition, and he comes with a seal full of maggots, stinking like crazy. And the guy said, he comes, so he's holding that seal, and the guy said, "There's no way you're going to put that on the boat." And the Inuit is pissed because for him it's like he found a brie, or a green cheese, a camembert,
He was
and
excited.
he's being told to get rid of it, and for him it makes no sense. So that's another example of where encountering other people's view make you think your own, make you rethink your own views.
Wow. So rotten meat. Yeah, I mean, I guess. I mean, if I stop the thing, I mean, obviously, it's not what I'm used to. It
Yeah,
doesn't sound appetizing to me. But when you start to think about hunter gatherers and living out in the wild
yeah,
as an ancient
yeah.
human, if there's maggots, the maggots have protein. Maybe they've pre-digested some of the food material, and it's actually easier if it's eaten raw, if you can't cook it or things like that. So, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so doing ethnohistory, it's you're colliding with others' view all the time. And some are trivial, but the others are quite spectacular.
Hmm.
Uh,
Are there any other are there any other aspects as like an ethnographer and a
yeah.
paleoanthropologist, like everything that you've studied, are there any what are some of the things today that we take for granted that we think are normal that like you think most hunter gatherers would probably find very bizarre? I mean, besides the obvious, obviously they wouldn't know what an iPad is, but in terms of
Yeah.
something that's maybe more of an everyday thing, do we also do weird things that would seem very weird to them?
Well, simple things like, we have 3 meals a day.
Mm.
That's culturally constructed. Some groups eat twice, some eat a little bit all the day, all through the day. Some will have a big meal in the morning and a lighter one. So it's highly variable. So the idea that we have a lunch at 6 together as a family, that would probably be strange to many people. Uh, um, well, maybe the obsession about hygiene.
Mm.
Okay. When you read about natives, what you see is that they say it's stinky, dirty, and everything. And we have example, for instance, a beautiful quote we found where a woman has a child on her and she's cutting meat. The baby poo on her. She used the knife to scrape off the excrement, and she continued cutting the meat. You know, that's the level of hygiene. If you're used to that and you live like that, it's not you don't think about that. But the idea here that you must have perfectly sterile toilets and stuff like that, that would be so foreign to native people who have not met Westerners before.
Hmm. Does your study of humans and human evolution, in particular, things like diet and our ability to adapt and be flexible and the things they eat, does that influence how you think about what you eat today in our
Oh,
modern
yes,
food environment?
completely. Yes, completely. Like about the high meat, for instance, I'm less concerned that I should be, I guess. Uh, so that's an example. A lot of things you just realize, okay, that's this is a cultural construct. I'm not saying it necessarily changes the way I do things on a daily basis, but it clearly opens the mind about how you view things, and it makes you understand also why people behave in a certain way. Like I said about when I was talking about the collective action problems, you better understand why it's so hard, for instance, to prevent people from hunting species uh, that are close to extinction. It's very
Mhm.
hard because you require some kind of knowledge about the metapopulation that nobody has. You require scientists to collect information for you and tell you this is how it's going, for that species. But, on a regular empirical basis, observation basis by people, there's no way to know other than saying it seems that there were more of that animal before than now, but that's it, you know.
What in your research today, right now, what are some of the questions that you're thinking about and working on today?
Well, right now for instance, I'm working on a monograph on hunting. I try to, um, whether we want it or not, when we think about the Paleolithic, very quickly we come to the idea of spears and individual hunters. But, the ethnohistory and the ethnography made me realize there's way more to hunting than just a single method. And now I realize that hunting is probably, in fact, a range of different methods that are used in different contexts. In our society, a hunter is a guy with a gun, probably waiting in a shelter or something for an animal to show up. Okay. That's tainting our way of looking at hunting. Whereas, for native, it's probably a range of methods that when you are in situation A, you use method one. And in situation B, you use method two, and so on. So that's what I'm concerned with right now, is trying to, in other words, to enrich or at least rethink our models of hunting.
Are there any final thoughts you want to leave people with respect to human evolution, how you think about it, or maybe a good takeaway that you think
Hmm.
people should have when they think about our own species and where it came from?
Well, I would say first, we underestimate how things have changed in the recent past. Okay. When you look at foragers today, there are a tiny portion of the variability that existed, let's say in 1500. There's so much more to learn from these travelers, these Jesuits, these missionaries that were traveling through so-called wild, countries. So there's a much to learn. The past was probably way more varied than people think. And, a lot of models are simplistic. They assume, one population moving out, replacing another. I think life is way more complicated than that. And as a result, what we need is better, richer models that are based on ethnographic observation and ethnohistorical observation.
All right, Eugene Morin, thank you for your time. That was fascinating. A lot of cool stuff. I think you do really interesting research, and I had a lot of fun looking at some of it the last couple of days. And thank you.
Thank you so much.